Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hello, everyone. Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton. So this week, I'm going to start a little bit differently. Today is mine and Curtis's 10-year anniversary.
Happy anniversary, Liz.
Thank you. I am the cheesy romantic type, so I am dedicating this episode to Curtis, and I just wanted to remind him how important he is to me and how much I appreciate everything he does for me and his family. Most people know I'm really open about my anxiety and depression, and through this last decade, Curtis has handled it with nothing but grace and patience. And that's something I could never thank him enough for. It has meant the world to me how well he has always handled my outbursts, my ups and downs. He's always been there. He's always been supportive, willing to talk to me and willing to help me out in any way that he can in carrying this extra burden that we share together. And he is my absolute favorite person. After 10 years, he is still my favorite one to be around, my favorite person to get a text from or a phone call. And we are an unstoppable team. And I feel confident that we will meet any challenge that comes our way. So happy anniversary, Curtis.
That is such a great way to describe your relationship. And it's appropriate for our topic tonight.
Yes, it is. And that is exactly why I chose this topic, common marriage problems.
I'm going to go out on a limb. Usually I don't make absolute statements. I'm going to make an absolute statement. I think the most important decision we ever make is who we choose to marry.
I absolutely agree. It's an extremely important decision, especially once kids get involved.
Yeah.
Because, once kids are involved, you are tied to that person forever. No matter what, because of that child you guys have together. I couldn't imagine having picked anyone better than Curtis. I feel like we make an amazing team. And sure, we've had our differences and our disagreements in the past, but overall, we work really well together and we make a great parenting team. I really believe that.
I feel the same way about Lindy. We're coming up on 46 years, and
that's awesome.
I just consider myself incredibly lucky to have met her, and we decided to get married. So.
Yeah, my parents recently hit 30 years, and that's our goal, to make it to that and beyond. So I admire couples who have been together that long, because marriage isn't always easy, but it is always, always worth it.
Yes.
It's what makes us happy. Relationships
That's right.
Make us happy.
That's right.
So, common marriage problems. Is there a number one reason that you see as a counselor as to why couples seek counseling?
Yeah, and that's an easy one. I would guess most couples, over 90% of the couples who come and sit on my couch in that first session, they might talk about the big three. We've mentioned those: sex, money, in-laws. But one of them is going to say, we don't communicate well. And so if you think of all the issues that might happen, even in the first year or, throughout the course of the marriage, if you communicate well, you can really get through mostly anything, I think. And it is the fundamental characteristic. Good communication is a fundamental characteristic of good marriages, I think. And then communication, you have to be able to listen well.
Yes.
And a lot of people come in and it's pretty easy to see the interaction that they don't listen to each other because they're not doing it in my office. They aren't listening well to each other. So I would say it's communication. We should get more into that, in a few minutes. But as far as, what are the other problems? I think that I've said this before. I think it takes 5 to 10 years to figure out how to learn to be married. And so I always look at it as these two mini cultures that come together. Because if you think of how we each grow up, we spend holidays in a certain way. We do birthdays in a certain way. We take vacations in a certain way. And so, and even communication within the family. We may talk about emotions, and a lot of families never talk about emotions. We may talk about sex in a positive way, and a lot of families never talk about that. So
Mhm.
what we grow up getting used to is different. And so you take these two mini cultures and you bring them together, and it takes work and focus to make them work. And I've always been amazed that people think it ought to just be so easy. And I
Mhm.
think sometimes it is because you've got this passion, in the first, it's pretty strong passion, and
Yeah.
the physical attraction and the physical connection is pretty strong.
So I've once described falling in love as blinding at first
Uh-huh.
because you're wearing those rose-colored glasses. And
Oh,
that's a
yeah.
good thing because it allows you to fall deeper in love with this person and you're both kind of putting your best foot forward. But eventually those rose-colored glasses are going to come off and you're going to be left seeing this person for who they really are. And
Right.
at that point, you have to make a choice. Do I still choose to love this person unconditionally as I committed to? Or do I just decide to focus on their shortcomings and all these little things that annoy me and ruin the relationship? And so, falling in love, it's an amazing high and it feels great, but you have to recognize that there's going to be struggles.
Right. And so, you've got that hormonal surge that
Hmm.
happens, in the first few years. I think it lasts 6 months to 2 years. But after that, it starts to quiet down. And so you don't have that intensity that, you're used to. A
Hmm.
lot of people think, oh, we're falling out of love. But it's just, you're falling into a more, I would call it a more stable pattern. And so the issues that come up, I think a lot are about how do you blend these two mini cultures? And that's where the listening comes in. So the communication, I mean, here are some common issues. What do we do about each other's families on holidays? It's a big
Hmm.
one that I hear about. And so you have to be willing to listen to the other person, to have that compromise and accommodation that I've talked about that is so important in marriage. And, it's the communication about talking about those issues that come up.
Hmm.
That's why I think it's 5 to 10 years, because you're coming up with all these things. What do we do about holidays? How do we celebrate birthdays? Sexuality generally works pretty well in the first few years.
Hmm.
That's an issue that I think arises later on. But the in-law one, that's one that usually comes up in the first few years because you're trying to
Yeah.
figure out, you're creating your own little family unit and even then it's just the two of you, right?
Hmm.
All these new things arise in that first year. And a lot of it has to do with extended family because you're trying to figure
Hmm.
that out. Because you want to spend time with your family, your spouse wants to spend time with their family.
Hmm.
You've got your own little mini culture going, your own little family, even though it's just the two of you. You still created this family.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of give and take. And
Hmm.
so you have to be able to be willing to do that give and take and to come up with a solution that seems fair. And so that's why the listening and the communication is really important. Because if you dig your heels in and say, nope, we're spending Christmas Eve with my family because that's the way it's always been
Hmm.
done. I've heard this certainly. People come in and they think, okay, we're going to do it my way. And so you have to be willing to listen to the other person and be open to compromise. And that's
Yeah.
hard for a lot of people.
So I have a really good friend and the way her family has done it, and she's the youngest in her family, and this was just something that her parents implemented with her older siblings. And she was fortunate enough that her husband's parents just jumped on board with it and were fine with it. So they alternate every year. So one year they'll spend Thanksgiving with her parents and Christmas with his parents, and then the next year they flip it. Yeah,
That's a
and
good compromise.
it is. I feel like it is. And I think the hardest part is that it involves more than just the two of you.
Hmm.
There's other people involved and feelings are going to get hurt and parents might say, "Why aren't you spending Christmas with me? Like you're my daughter and you're not going to give me Christmas, which that can be incredibly hard. But you have to realize that once you are married, your individual family unit is now the number one most important family unit.
That is a really hard thing for a lot of couples, though, Liz, because that's
Yeah.
exactly what happens. Because often it's, I presented it a minute ago as, the spouses are saying, let's go to my family. But often it's the parents who
Yep.
are saying,
Hmm.
why aren't you coming? Because you're right about other people being involved, because each of you, likely have siblings. And so you've got these sibling groups on both sides, and the parents want all the siblings together.
Hmm.
And it is incredibly difficult to organize. And so the pressure often comes from the parents. And what's hard is for us, even as adult married children, to then say to mom or dad, no, we aren't going to do that.
Hmm.
That's really tough for a lot of people. That's where the problems come, is we often aren't willing to say no. It's really an important thing to learn how to say. But what you said a second ago is important. You have to learn that your family unit, the two of
Hmm.
you at that point, is the most important family unit in your
Yeah.
world. It's not that your extended family isn't important, because it is.
Yes.
It's just you have to really focus and prioritize the little family unit that you have created.
Yeah, I've said this before. Extended family very much belongs in your life. They have absolutely no place in your marriage.
I
Absolutely
like
none.
that. I like
Yeah.
that. Yes. Yeah, in your life, but not in your marriage. But
Hmm.
that can be a big problem,
It
because
can.
often parents like to stick themselves inside the marriage and tell you what to
Hmm.
do and tell you how to, how you ought to be married to each other. So that can be a problem, standing up to your parents now that you're married. That is a common problem. So the often money issues do come up in the first year, because likely you've been independent, and each of you
Hmm.
may have your own professions that you're in and earning your own money. And so the question then becomes: do we merge the finances? How do we merge the finances? Do we keep separate checking accounts? I really don't know that there's a right or a wrong to this, because I've seen it
Yeah.
work well. I've seen it work well either way. It goes back to the communication. It's how
Hmm.
are you listening to each other, and how good are you at, making those decisions and those compromises.
I think the most important thing is going to be full disclosure before marriage. And we've talked about this before, how important it is to talk about it before you get married. I mean, because once you're engaged and you're going to be committing your life to someone, you have the right to ask them, how much money do you make? Do you have any debt?
Oh,
Those are
yes.
things you need
Oh,
to know
yes.
beforehand.
Yes. And so I'll mention that book again that I've mentioned before. It's called Lies at the Altar. The
Hmm.
author is Robin Smith. And one of the chapters is 276 questions to ask before you get married. And
Hmm.
so it includes those questions about, do you have any debt? It's surprising how many people don't ask that. I think I mean, 46 years ago, neither one of us had a credit card that you
Yeah.
know, that was not that common. So we didn't have any debt. But nowadays, everybody has a credit card. And so you have to ask that question. And if you don't, I think you're being a bit negligent,
Yeah.
so, and if you really want to make the marriage work, shouldn't wait till you're asked. You should
Yeah.
say, here's what I have. I don't want, the full disclosure, use that term. I think that's really important. That sets the expectation
Yep.
that we're going to be transparent.
Hmm.
And, we've talked about that in the past. And we've talked about it in terms of, like last week, how do you repair, say, from an infidelity? And I
Hmm.
think that it's not just then that you need it. You need to have transparency from day one.
Hmm.
Now, my experience is that women, and I'm going to maybe people will think it's a sexist statement, but this is my experience. Women generally have an easier time with transparency.
Okay.
Men generally have a very tough time with that. And I think in some ways we raise men to think they need to be independent.
Hmm.
So in the first year of marriage, I think often it can be more difficult for men, because when you choose to get married, you are choosing to be accountable to each other.
Yeah.
And so if you think, and I've seen this before, I've seen it in newlyweds where the guy decides to get married, but he wants to have a single guy life still.
It doesn't work.
So it's never going to work. It's
No.
just not going to work. And,
Mm-mm.
I've seen it where the wife says, okay, that's fine. Where it changes is when they have kids.
Yep. Kids
And
change everything.
kids change everything. I mean, here's one that is common too, is nowadays there are a lot of people use cannabis. Let's say the guy is using cannabis regularly and the
Mm-hmm.
wife doesn't care. When they have kids, then
Yeah.
she cares. If you aren't okay with it when you have kids, then don't be okay with it when you don't. I mean, there are things that you really need to explore those things. Like, do you use drugs? I mean,
Yeah.
that's one thing that I would ask. How do you use cannabis? How often do you use cannabis? Things like that.
What are your drinking habits
What are
like?
your drinking habits? That's a good one,
Mm-hmm.
because you don't want to, get married and 2 weeks in, he's drunk or she's drunk. I mean, it goes either way,
Mm-hmm.
on the weekend because it's just not going to work again.
That's what they've always done. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was interesting when Curtis and I first got engaged because he had been financially independent since he was 18 and he's 5 years older than me. So he'd been financially independent for 6 years by the time we got engaged. And that was an adjustment for him because he'd been used to doing it on his own. And when it came to making a purchase, he only had to convince himself. Like he had to justify it in his own mind and he just did it. And I feel like he adjusted really well to it, including me in those decisions, but it was definitely an adjustment to have to consider someone else. And
Hmm.
and that's really what it comes down to is there's going to be adjustments. You're going to have to make adjustments in
Yes.
your lifestyle.
And I know I've used this term before. I think you can think of yourself as becoming a team. And so you
Mhm.
become a financial team. You aren't
Yeah.
independent anymore. And if you want to be independent, then gosh, don't get married because
Mhm.
I think that's part of the deal is that you become dependent. And I think in one of our previous episodes, we explored the difference between dependent and codependent. That
Mhm.
was quite a few episodes ago. And I think that marriage, you are dependent on each other, and there's nothing wrong with that. Otherwise, why get married? That's part of the deal. And so you choose to be a team. You're a financial team. I say this a lot. You're a sexual team with
Mhm.
each other. And then you mentioned earlier parenting. It's really important that you pick someone who you believe is going to be a good parent, if that's a value for you.
Yes, and the great thing is when you become dependent on someone else, when things do get hard, let me tell you, it is incredible to have someone to fall back on and help give you the support that you need. Curtis and I have both felt that in our lives. There's been times where I have been sleep deprived, grouchy, and irritable because I've got a new baby who's not doing well, and I really leaned on him to help pick up the extra slack. And lately, he's been leaning on me. I've had to pick up the extra slack because work has just been insane. And it's just so relieving to know that you have someone to help lift you up when times are hard. That is hands down the best part of being dependent on someone. It's secure, it feels safe, and it just feels good.
Can we talk a little bit more about communication? I'd love to go into just a little bit more detail if that's okay.
Yeah, let's do it.
I think that what couples do is they focus too readily on finding a solution.
Mhm.
And I think that they need to focus more on the emotion. Now that is something that most couples coming into the marriage are not used to doing.
Yeah.
And so the focusing on the emotion starts with really listening and understanding well,
Mhm.
validating the other person's position and having empathy. Now, if you do that for each other and you're really listening to each other, then the fourth step could be to find a solution.
Mhm.
And so some of the suggestions that I give is try to not ask why. Like,
Mhm.
why don't you want to go to my parents on Christmas Eve? Because why puts us automatically into a defensive mode.
Mhm.
And one of the things that you're going to learn over the years of being married is how to not be defensive because it
Yes.
kills being defensive kills this process, kills the communication process. And so if you can change any why question and you can change it to what, how, when, where, Now, can we try a little exercise if that's all
Sure.
right? If you're,
Yeah,
this will
let's
be
do it.
easy.
Okay.
Okay, and this is often with couples, I'll do this in the first session to show them what this is like. Now we can take, a real issue that they're going through, but I have what I call my Oprah questions because I think
Okay.
this whole list of questions came from O Magazine. So this is the one that I like to start with. And I'm going to ask it of you, and we'll just do it really briefly.
Okay.
If you could go anywhere on vacation without constraints, so no constraints of
Mm-hmm.
time, money, or obligations, where would you go?
Um, oh, you're putting me on the spot here. I would have to say maybe New Zealand or somewhere where I could go hiking, where I could explore and do fun outdoorsy things.
Okay, so what is it about New Zealand that really attracts you?
The scenery. I've heard that the scenery is absolutely beautiful and just I love being in the woods, hiking trails, that kind of stuff.
What do you love about that, about hiking in general?
It just feels good. It's exercise, it gets your endorphins going, the nature, the beauty of it. And I think it often reminds me of my childhood. I grew up in Washington State and it's always green there and I love it. And I loved hiking in Washington and being out in the woods and camping in my youth.
So we won't go any further, but see, you could keep going, down deeper. But when you said that, see, all of a sudden it makes sense. It's going to be easy to validate that
Okay.
because what happens is you want to go to New Zealand, somewhere new, but it's the green, it's the hiking.
Mhm.
And then you said it reminds me of my childhood. See, often just doing this type of, I mean, I hate to call it questioning, but just having this dialogue,
Yeah.
you're going to go back to your childhood. And so it has real emotional meaning for
Mhm.
you. The word you're using is you really love it. So I just want to point out something. What I did is I asked you one question at the top, and then the next question I asked you was really based on the answer of the previous question.
Mhm.
Where do you want to go, New Zealand? What is it about New Zealand? And then it's the green, it's the hiking. And then you came up with it reminds me of my childhood. And so you're going to deeper levels of meaning and understanding. And that's what I try and help couples do. I mean, hopefully it'd be easy for most people to really hear that emotional
Mhm.
impact that it has for you, and
Mhm.
what you just said. And it makes total sense that you'd want to do that. And so a lot of people would stay away from it because of that question, because they'd say, oh gosh, we don't have the time or the money to go to New Zealand. That's not the point.
Yeah. Yep.
And John Gottman, the guy I've mentioned a lot who does the marriage research, he talks about how important it is for couples to have the dialogue around what he calls their dreams.
Mhm.
And the example he always uses is somebody wants to go climb Mount Everest. Now, the people who go climb Mount Everest are very, very, very few. It
Mhm.
doesn't mean that you don't talk about it, though, and you don't find what's important about it. Just like, we said, well, what's important about going to New Zealand? So, hopefully you get there. But again, that's not the point.
Right.
The point is to get to be able to say, that makes sense to me, Liz, that you want to go to New Zealand and do hiking. And it does.
Mhm. Mhm. Right. And so one of Curtis's favorite games to play is what would you do if you had $1 billion?
Oh, I love it. Well, that's one of the questions. It used to
Yep.
be, what would you do if you had a million? But we had to
Yeah.
up it. Had to up-
Right.
it's
Right.
not enough anymore.
No. And we've talked about what would we do with $1 million too. It's like, well, it wouldn't go very far in today's world. But yeah, but that's one of Curtis's favorite topics. He's come back to it throughout these years in our marriage of, what would you do if we won the lottery?
Yeah. Yeah.
That kind of thing. And neither of us plays the lottery or has any inclination to play the lottery, but we've talked about that. And another thing I wanted to say is just out of curiosity, I looked up those 200 and whatever odd.
76 questions. Yeah.
I looked those up and I just started asking Curtis those questions. Some of them I knew the answer to. A lot of them actually I knew the answer to, but I was just curious and I said, I think this would be a good conversation. And we haven't even gotten through even close to half of them, but it's opened up new dialogue to us
Mhm.
and it's been fantastic. So if you've been married for a number of years, Find those questions, and you can look them up online. You just search the book. I'll have a link to it in our show notes again. But just look up those questions and just go through and find one that you don't know the answer to, or that you don't 100% know the answer to. Because sometimes I look at it and I'm like, well, I'm pretty sure this is what he's going to say, but maybe not. And it's opened up great dialogue for us.
Yeah. And so here's what, referencing Gottman again, he calls it love maps. And so I'll just remind our listeners that he's a guy who does research, has done research for over 40 years on what is the difference between successful couples and unsuccessful couples. And one of the things in successful couples is he calls it their love maps. They know each other's love maps, which is just what you're talking about, is that we know the other person's world. We are curious about the other person's world, what goes on in their day, who they interact with, what are their challenges. And those questions are really, that's what it's speaking to, is it lets you in on the other person's world.
And it can be so easy as the years go on to kind of lose that curiosity because, I mean, you've spent every day together for how many years? And I was thinking about that a while ago. For the last 10 years, probably 10 and a half years, Curtis and I have talked to each other every single day. Most days we've even seen each other. Okay, there's been one day where we haven't talked to each other because he was on a camping trip. Mm-hmm. But I mean, other than that, we've talked to each other every single day, even if we're apart, even if we've been apart visiting family, we've still at least talked to each other. And on the one hand, that's amazing. But on the other hand, it can be really easy to get complacent and to just get too comfortable in your marriage and just think, well, we've been married for this long, I think we're going to be fine. And oftentimes, maybe you stop investing into your relationship, and that's a big mistake.
It is a big mistake. And the way I frame it, people hate the idea of you have to work at marriage. So I don't use that word anymore. Mm-hmm. I say you have to focus every day on marriage, and you really do. And if you do not focus on your relationship every day, the image I get is it's like you have a garden and you don't focus on the garden. And at least here in Utah, after about 3 days, the weeds come up. Right?
Yep.
And so if you're focusing every day, the weeds don't come up. And I think it's the same with marriage, is that you really need to focus every day. What am I going to do today that's going to make my relationship better? Or what am I going to do today that's going to show my spouse that I really care about them?
So I talked about this last week. I like to think of marriages as an investment. Mm-hmm. And you have to invest every day into that relationship.
So I think of it as the marital bank account.
Yeah.
And so,
yep.
How many times this week did I talk about that? So the way you fill the marital bank account is by those positive things. I mean, there are a lot of positive things. The positive words we say, the positive interactions. And so if you don't focus and fill that marital bank account, then when the bumps come, which they will, because they do in every marriage, then you're in a deficit situation. You're overdrawn in your bank account. And if you're overdrawn for very long, it becomes very, very difficult. And so I see couples often who they're in a negative situation in their bank account. And one of the first things you try and do is figure out, how do you start having positive interactions? Yep. They always think, well, we aren't addressing the real problem. We are addressing the real problem. The real problem is you don't focus on the positives in your relationship and fill that account. So it is an investment. Mm-hmm. And you have to put money into that bank account every day.
Yep, exactly. So one topic I really want to get to before we run out of time is sex in a marriage. And I know we've done an entire episode about sexuality in a relationship, but one thing I wanted to talk about is when you have a high desire partner versus a lower desire partner. And I don't think it's very common for couples to have an equal sexual desire all the time. And
it only happens in 20% of couples that you are equal.
And, it's interesting because when Curtis and I first got married, oddly enough, I was the higher desire couple. And, well, then I had kids.
Yeah.
And now it's flipped.
I told it for everybody. So you're right. It is the biggest problem in sexuality, other than often they think of fertility issues as being a sexual problem. But fertility issues are a big problem, but I don't deal with those at all. So
Right.
it is the difference in level of desire. And so we go back to dialogue and
Mm-hmm.
communication.
Yeah.
The most important thing you can do in sexuality from day one to, into your 60s and 70s is have a good dialogue
Yeah.
about, you have to be able to talk openly, and you really have to approach it the way I just described, meaning that because there's a lot of emotion that is tied
Mm-hmm.
up in sexuality. And so if you're only focusing on finding the solution, I think you're missing the point. The point is
Yeah.
to really get to know the other person, what's working, what's not working, what's going on with them emotionally in the sexual relationship. And it's not until you can really have a good understanding of that, being curious. I don't know, I love that word, being curious. You
Mm-hmm.
have to maintain that curiosity about your partner. And that means, being curious about them sexually as well.
Yeah.
So that difference in level of desire, you're going to have to figure out a compromise to that.
Mm-hmm.
It's expected that when you get married, you're going to have sex.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really hard if, 2 years into it or a year into it, you say, well, I'm not going to have sex with you anymore. I mean, in a way, what you've done is you've really gone against the expectations and the agreement that you made. We're going to get married. I agree to only have sex with you.
Yeah.
And so 2 years later, you can't say, well, I'm not going to have sex with you anymore.
Sex should never be used as a weapon either. That's a
No,
big, big red flag if you're
no.
using
And
it as a
so
weapon.
there
Or
are
withholding sex or
withholding
withholding.
sex should not be a weapon. No.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you do have to be able to have a good positive dialogue. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that starts from day one, because I certainly see many couples, 5 years in, 10 years into it, and sexuality's been an issue from day one for a lot of them, and they don't
Mm-hmm.
talk about it. They
Yeah.
never have talked about it.
And one thing I would say that is important to talk about if you're the high desire partner, find out what your partner likes. Find out, ask them what they find arousing. You have to have what can often be those awkward and uncomfortable dialogues. They are so important.
Yeah, but I mean, hopefully they aren't awkward or uncomfortable. I mean,
Yeah.
that goes back to what I said earlier, that, from families of origin, if you haven't been used to talking about that or having it be something you talk about, then that can be a shock. But,
Mhm.
for most marriages, the vast majority, they've agreed to be monogamous. And so
Mhm.
you're going to share this with just this one person. You ought to be able to talk about it in an open way. And is it uncomfortable at first? Yes. I acknowledge that for a lot of couples, it's going to be. For a lot of couples, it's not. But for some, it's going to be uncomfortable. The more you do it, the more
Mhm.
you talk about it, the easier it gets. And you talk about those things just like you said.
Yeah.
What is it that you like? What can we do together that feels good? Things like that.
Or what helps you to feel comfortable and relaxed enough? Because I know
Mhm.
from a woman's perspective, there's times where I just, at the end of the day, I feel emotionally tapped out. Because I mean, I've been giving of myself all day
Yeah.
to my kids and everything else. And it's like, okay, I don't have anything else to give. And it's
Mhm.
important for men to acknowledge that. And not that men can't feel that too. Emotionally exhausted and tapped out. It just doesn't usually affect their sex drive because
Because of that, they have the higher testosterone.
yes. And so men just naturally have a higher sex drive. And it can be incredibly frustrating for them when they come into a marriage and their wife has incredibly low sex drive and they're like, well, why? We're married. Why is this so hard? And again, but it's that why question that you
Mhm.
need to avoid. So I think if you could ask, what helps you to feel relaxed? What helps you to feel comfortable? What can I do to help ease your burden? I saw this really funny video. It was how to send sexy pictures to your wife. And it's this
Uh-huh.
husband taking pictures of himself doing the dishes, taking out the
Oh,
trash, sweeping the
okay,
floor.
that comes from a book. I'll mention the
Okay.
book. It's called Porn for Women.
Okay.
Yeah, and what that's all it is. So it's
Okay.
got these guys, and they're good looking guys, but they're vacuuming, they're and they're making these comments as far as watching television. What ballet do you want to watch tonight, dear? And so it It's going into your partner's role. It's really funny, but it's really true as
It
well.
is. Yeah.
Yeah. So, if anybody wants a good laugh about that, but that's what it is.
Porn
It's
for
just,
women. That's going to
it's,
turn a lot of people off, but it's
it's,
funny.
it's pictures of guys doing nice things for their partners.
But like you said, it works
It
and
is, and
it's
it's
true.
true. It's true. So yes, talking about sex from day one is really important. And here's the thing that Gottman found also is that couples waited on average 7 years before coming to seek help about their issues.
Hmm.
And the problem is, if those problems become entrenched in the relationship, it becomes very, very difficult to deal with them. Whereas if you've either had a good dialogue or early on you figure you need some help, the couples that really do well are the ones who come in after 6 months, where I see a lot of couples who come in before. And they say, we just want to head off, any problems, or early on, they're willing to come
Yeah.
in and get help. Those are the couples who are going to be successful
And
because
I
they haven't waited too long.
And I think it's because they genuinely care, and from the beginning, they want to fight for that relationship. So I can think of the one time that Curtis and I felt like we had genuine conflict or genuine difficulty in our marriage. And I've talked about this before on our show. And it really came down to what you said, a breakdown in communication, and we really weren't listening to each other. But I mean, there was genuine friction, and it was friction that I'd never felt before in our marriage. And it was a little scary for me because I'd never experienced anything like this. And I was considering, okay, if this doesn't resolve itself soon, we're going to counseling. And it doesn't mean that you're a weak couple or that, you're not meant to be. I think it shows incredible strength, humility, and courage to seek counseling
You just
because
need help to get over that bump yeah.
yeah, and it can be so helpful to have an unaffiliated third party help you work through your problems. Someone who can help you take a step back and say, okay, this is what I can see from an observational standpoint. They're not tangled up in the emotions of it, because when there's conflict in a marriage, it's all about the emotion, and it can be really hard to see past your own emotions.
See, that's it. If the listeners take away one thing, it's that in the communication, focus more on the emotional content.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you'll get to solution. And it's not that I don't think solution is important, because solution or resolution is.
Yeah.
I just think we go there too quickly and we don't focus on the emotion.
Yeah, a counselor can be incredibly helpful in navigating through those emotions, because when you're feeling your own emotions, it can be hard to focus on what the other person is feeling. And I think a counselor can really help to cause you to look at the other person's perspective.
Yeah, I agree. And it can teach you some skills.
Yeah,
communication typically.
Yeah, I'm a really big advocacy of counseling, and well, obviously you are too, because it's what you do for a living.
I am.
All right, guys, I hope you all have a good week. Next week, we're going to talk about building good relationships with teenagers. So that should be a good episode. And if you like this podcast, do us a favor and share it with someone, or tell someone about it and how to find us. It really helps us reach more people, and it helps spread our mission, which is to break the stigma around mental health. So we will see you all next week.
Have a good week. Happy anniversary again, Liz.
Thank you. Happy anniversary to Curtis. Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.